everybody. This is Audrey Folsom. We're going to go over your lesson on the female reproductive system again. And so let's talk about the organs of the female reproductive system. The organs of the female reproductive systems are the cells that are specialized to produce and maintain the egg cells, to transport these cells to the site of fertilization, and to provide a favorable environment for a developing fetus to give birth and to produce female sex hormones. So your primary sexual organs are the gonads, and they are, in the female, there are the ovaries. So the ovaries are the equivalent to the testes in the males, which testes are the gonads for the males. The other parts of the system comprise of the external and internal accessory organs. Alright, so in this diagram, color the ovaries, and we're going to go over it. So this diagram here, of course, has it like a side view, so if you cut it down the midline, but it's important for it to see that way too. So you have your bladder right here with the urethra and the exit, and then on top of it you have your uterus with the cervix and the vagina, and then here's the fallopian tubes, and here is the ovary. Okay, so let's talk ovaries. So the ovaries are solid, ovoid structures. They're located within the lateral pelvic cavity, so you have one on each side, left and right. The ovaries are subdivided into a medulla and an outer cortex. The medulla is always in the middle, so right here, medulla, right here, and then the cortex is here where all the follicles are. The medulla is made up of connective tissue, blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerve, and you can see the difference here, what this looks like and what that looks like. And the cortex contain the ovarian follicles. You can see different stages of maturation here. And they're covered by cuboidal epithelium, the ovarian follicles are. Alright, so during prenatal development, when the little girl is in the womb of her mama, small groups of cells form millions, literally millions, of primordial follicles. So each of these will consist of a primary oocyte that's surrounded by follicular cells. So these are, if you will, all the egg stem cells. And then early in development, so we're still in the womb here, the primary oocytes will begin to undergo meiosis. Meiosis is where you have that shuffling of that genetic material. So the shuffling that's going to be happening is going to be the genetic material basically of the baby girl's, the mama that she inherited from her mom and her dad. Okay, so, but the process will halt and does not resume then again until puberty. So only about 400,000 oocytes will remain at puberty, starting from the millions that were there before, and only 400 to 500 will be released from the ovary during the reproductive life of the female, meaning like she would have 400 to 500 periods, and that's considering an average reproductive life starting somewhere in your teenage years and going all the way till probably 40s and 50s, all the way up to 60s even, cycling and stuff until you hit menopause. So, oogenesis is a production of eggs. So, beginning at puberty, some of the oocytes are stimulated to continue meiosis, so continuing this division, and I'm going to show you a graphic that explains it. When a primary oocyte undergoes meiosis, it gives rise to a large haploid secondary oocyte in a polar body. So, the haploid secondary oocyte is what we're going to be interested in. That's what will eventually be released. The polar body is just junk. And then you're going to get another unequal cytoplasmic division that will give rise to the egg cell in the polar body. And polar bodies have no function and they will degenerate. Okay, so here's the graphic that's promised. So here's the primary oocyte. Okay, so start with a whole bunch of those, and they'll start undergoing some of them first meiotic division. And then at puberty, we're going to start producing these secondary oocytes here. So when you start here with this basically egg stem cell, the primary oocyte, you have 46 chromosomes, each with 2 chromatids. What this means is you have 46 chromosomes that have already made copies of themselves. So really, if you counted the chromosomes, without considering the ones that are attached by chromatids, you actually have 92 of them, okay, there. But you're just going to have, if you look at it here, this could be chromosome 1. So normally you have an arm of chromosome 1 from that the mom here got from her mom, and one that she got from her dad. And those okay, they've made copies, so now you have, a copy, identical copy of this one is here. So this is chromosome 1 from mom, chromosome 1 from mom, chromosome 1 from dad, chromosome 1 from dad. And this is what I'm talking about, the mother's mom and dad here. Okay, so then these are going to divide up. So just say this is chromosome 1, this is chromosome 2, and all of them they're going to line up like that, and they're going to divide. One of the arms are going to go this way, the other one's going to go that way. And so that's why it's meiosis, because you have this shuffling of the genetic material. And it could be, mixed matched another way where, the genetic material of the dad had gone this way and the mom had gone that way. So either way, this half becomes polar body and divides again. All that is junk. But let's follow what happens here. So then you have the secondary oocyte is going to be released as an egg, but it has undergone, after this first meiotic division, it still has to undergo another meiotic division, and that will happen after fertilization. So the secondary oocyte here, 23 chromosomes with 2 chromatids, so you have 2 copies here of chromosome 1, you have 2 copies of chromosome 2, but they're still attached within, by the little centromere here. And these guys still have to split, okay, because we want 23 chromosomes with 1 chromatid each, okay, because the sperm is bringing 23 chromosomes with 1 chromatid, okay, and so this is diploid, this is haploid. And so if fertilization occurs, then this is going to finish dividing, and half of this genetic material, so here we have chromosome 1, chromosome 2, so one chromatid is going to go this way, the other one's going to go that way, and the sperm is going to bring its little nucleus, so half the genetic material is going to become the second polar body and degenerate, and the other half here is going to become the female pronucleus and eventually merge with the sperm nucleus, and that's going to be for the next lesson. So let's talk about follicle maturation. So at puberty, FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone, initiates follicle maturation. So it stimulates the follicles to mature, follicle stimulating hormone, during which the follicles will enlarge, the follicular cells proliferate, and then a fluid-filled cavity will form around it, forming that secondary follicle right here. So this is what it looks like. The mature follicle, which is called an antral follicle, contains the secondary oocyte right here, and it's surrounded by the zona pellucida, which is attached to the corona radiata. It looks like a crown right here. And a follicle development, the development of one follicle takes about 300 days. And so you have one that reaches maturation every 28 days. And so you'll have follicles at different stages of maturation at any time during the month. Okay, so your first poll question here, more primary oocytes will mature into how many eggs? 1, 2, 3, or 4. So it is different than for the sperms. And let's talk ovulation. So a process called ovulation releases a secondary oocyte from the surface of the ovary. So there is the release there of that secondary oocyte, and it's still surrounded by a layer of follicular cells. And then you will have that burst of luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary does trigger this release, this ovulation. Okay, luteinizing hormone, luteus, is yellow. Well, it makes what's left of this antral follicle that's left behind in the ovary, it makes it turn yellow, and that's why it's luteinizing hormone. Okay, and if the oocyte is not fertilized shortly after it's been released, it will degenerate. So in the meantime, the corpus luteum turns yellow, and it actually starts producing progesterone, and progesterone is going to help maintain the pregnancy if fertilization happens. And then it'll turn into the corpus albicans, which is white and means it's stopped producing progesterone. So in this little diagram, where do you think the mature follicle is? Circle it, and then where do you think the corpus luteum is? And look at the arrows and the sequence, and you should be able to figure that out. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the female internal accessory organs. So the female internal accessory organs consist of a pair of uterine tubes, a uterus, and a vagina. The uterine tubes, also known as oviducts or fallopian tubes, I always call them fallopian tubes because that's how I learned them, they're suspended by the broad ligament and they lead to the uterus, and they connect really the ovary to the uterus. Near each ovary, the uterine tube expands to form an infundibulum. So this is, it looks like this, like little fingers that are going to catch the egg, and those little fingers are called fimbriae. The cells lining the tubes bear cilia. Cilia are hair-like cells, and they beat in unison, drawing the egg into the uterine tube. So they're going to do this wave-like motion and move the egg down the uterine tube towards the uterus. And then fertilization generally occurs in the uterine tube close to the ovaries. So the sperm has to go all the way up the uterus and then all the way up the fallopian tube, almost to the ovary, in order to reach the egg and be able to fertilize it. So where are your fallopian uterine tubes? You can just color them or circle them. And so let's talk about the uterus. So the upper 2/3 of the uterus is called the body. It has a dome-shaped top, looks a little bit like a light bulb. The lower 1/3 of the uterus is the narrow part, and it's called the cervix. And the cervix is what extends into the vagina. The uterine wall has 3 layers. The inner glandular endometrium, that's where the baby would implant, and that's what you shed every month. The muscular wall, or the myometrium, so it's the muscular part of the uterus, and that's what would be doing contraction during labor and delivery. And the outer perimetrium, which kind of holds it all together there. And the uterus usually bends forward over the urinary bladder. So find the uterus and circle the uterus in this diagram. And find the cervix and circle the cervix in this diagram. Okay, so then the vagina is a fibromuscular tube, extends from the uterus to the outside. It's the birth canal also. And the vaginal orifice will be partially covered by a membrane called a hymen. That is while you are a virgin, and then it gets kind of broken off once you're no longer a virgin. And the vaginal wall consists of 3 layers. The inner mucosal layer, a middle muscular layer, and an outer fibrous layer. It conveys uterine secretions, receives the penis during intercourse, and will serve, of course, as the birth canal. So where is the vagina in this diagram? Circle it. And again, so here's another representation. So we have the vagina here, okay, and then the cervix, which is the bottom part of the uterus, the thinner part. And then you have the uterus is here, kind of looking this kind of a light bulb shaped dome with a dome up top here. You can see the endometrial layer, myometrium, and perimetrium, very vascular too. And then we can see the oviducts or fallopian tubes and the ovaries here that are suspended here, ovarian ligament, and these are suspended by the broad ligaments. So. And again, same view, side view again, this is the bladder, this is the uterus, cervix, ovary, fallopian tube, vagina. Okay, the external organs of the female reproductive system is called the vulva, and it includes the labia majora, labia minora, clitoris, and vestibular glands. The labia majora are they enclose and protect the other external reproductive organs that correspond to the scrotum of the male, and that's basically the 2 folds that have hairs on them, right? And the anterior ends meet to form the mons pubis, which is again where a bunch of the hair is usually located. The labia minora, they're flattened longitudinal folds between the labia majora, and they form a hood around the clitoris, and they're always pink, so they don't have hair on them and stuff. And they will, because of the many blood vessels, they are pink, but also they engorge during intercourse. And then the clitoris is a mass of erectile tissue at the anterior end of the vulva between the labia minora, and it's the equivalent of the penis in the male, but it's much smaller. The vestibule is the space that is enclosed by the labia minora, so it's basically the opening into the vagina, and it opens posteriorly, and the urethra opens in the midline. So you have urethra, and then below that you have the opening of the vagina. A pair of vestibular glands lie on either side of this vaginal opening, and they correspond to the bulbourethral glands of the males, and they provide the same thing that they do in the male, which is lubrication, and that's for sex. So, talking about sex, ejection, lubrication, orgasm, and all that, during periods of sexual stimulation, the erectile tissues of the clitoris and the vestibular bulbs will become engorged with blood due to the action of nitric oxide. Same process as in the male. The vestibular glands will secrete mucus into the vestibule and the vagina, and during orgasm, the muscles of the perineum, uterine wall, and uterine tubes will all contract rhythmically. And we'll see in the next lesson too that the part of the point of that is to help propel the sperm up to where potentially the egg is to be fertilized. You've seen this picture in the other lessons, so kind of showing the equivalent. So like here, the scrotum in the male is the equivalent of the labia majora here. This is the labia minora. You can see the opening into the urethra, the vaginal opening, and then this would be the penis in the male, but the clitoris in the female. So you can kind of see how these match up. So let's talk about hormones. Hormones are secreted by the hypothalamus, also the anterior pituitary, and then also the ovaries. And these all control female reproduction and development, and especially the development of your secondary sexual characteristics, which means basically your boobs, your hips, your curves, all your female curves and stuff. So at about 10 years of age, the hypothalamus begins to secrete more GnRH, so this is gonadotropin releasing hormone. And it crosses from the hypothalamus into the anterior pituitary, and it starts producing LH and FSH, so luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. And so this is going to start the process of puberty. So really what this is going to start releasing some little estrogens and progesterones and things like that. And so the little girl's going to be like in the preteen, starting to get attitudes, usually starting to get curves, starting to get little booblets, got to go get training bras and all of that. Okay, so estrogens, you have actually three types of estrogen. Yeah, estradiol, estrone, and estriol. They're responsible for your female secondary sexual characteristics, such as your breast development, increased adipose tissue deposition, so where your fat is stored, and increased vascularization of the skin, so how pretty your skin is. And so estradiol is the main one that women produce when they're cycling. And if I remember right, estriol is the one that's released during pregnancy, and estrone is the one that's actually present during menopause. Sometimes I get the menopause and pregnancy one backwards, so you might have to check me on that. But estradiol is the one that is associated with your cycle and ovulation and all of that. Ovaries will also secrete progesterone, and progesterone trigger uterine changes during the menstrual cycle, and we're going to look at all of this. Progesterone is important to maintain pregnancy. So progesterone is important for the back half of the cycle. Estrogen is important for the front half of the cycle. The androgens also play a role by producing some of the changes seen at puberty, such as pubic and axillary hair. The low androgen levels allow the broadening of the hips, and it can also affect libido. So androgens are the male hormones. So like the females do produce some testosterone. It does feed into sexual desire and other things like that. So really referred to as libido. So match up the hormone to what it does right here. And so let's talk a little bit about hormone imbalance. So this one is really interesting. So estrogen dominance means that you have too much estrogen in relationship to your progesterone. And why that would be usually is because there's endocrine disruptors in our environment, especially in a lot of beauty product, personal care products, cleaning products. They're called xenoestrogens, and you can look them up. But the symptoms of having too much estrogen, having estrogen dominance, would be decreased sex drive, irregular or otherwise abnormal menstrual periods, bloating, water retention, so breast swelling and tenderness, fibrocystic breast, headaches, especially premenstrually, mood swings, most often irritability and depression, weight and or fat gain, particularly around the abdomen and hips, cold hands and feet, which is really a symptom of thyroid dysfunction, hair loss and thyroid dysfunction, which hair loss is also a symptom of thyroid dysfunction, sluggish metabolism, foggy thinking, memory loss, fatigue, trouble sleeping, insomnia, PMS, and all of that. So Those are quite similar, and the reason is, so for example, BPA is a xenoestrogen. It's plasticizer, and this shape of the molecule here fits on the receptor, estrogen receptor, just like estrogen does. And so the body thinks that when BPA binds and is present, it's thinking it's actually estrogen signaling, and it can cause estrogen resistance. So again, the hypothalamus produces GnRH, which goes to the pituitary, anterior pituitary, causes a release of FSH and LH. FSH stimulates the maturation of your primordial follicle and meiosis in the primary oocyte to make the egg cells. And then luteinizing hormone, or LH, when it peaks, it will help release the egg. And the remaining, what's left of the follicle then becomes the hormone secreting corpus luteum that produces progesterone. So ovaries will release estrogen, and then estrogen will help develop the breast, vascularize the skin, enlarge the accessory reproductive organs, thickening of the endometrial layer of the uterus, which is what, as it thickens, will eventually become your period when you bleed, when it sheds, and then increase the position of adipose tissue in the breast, thighs, and buttocks, and so that gives you your curves. But the estrogen then gives a negative feedback and inhibits the oversecretions of these gonadotropins, LH and FSH. Okay, menarche is the monthly changes in the uterine lining that lead to menstrual flow. So if you're having a period, you are in menarche. And your menstrual flow is the shedding of the endometrium that was not used for pregnancy. The menstrual cycle is started by follicle stimulating hormone, which stimulates the maturation of a follicle in the ovary. And the follicular cells surround the developing oocytes start secreting estrogen, and estrogen helps maintain those secondary sexual characteristics, so they maintain your boobs and your curves and all of that, as well as the thickening of the uterine lining. So it starts building up that uterine lining here. And ovulation is triggered by a mid-cycle surge in luteinizing hormone. And we're going to look at a diagram here that's going to recap all of this. So following ovulation, the follicular cells turn into the corpus luteum. Corpus luteum will secrete increasing amounts of estrogen and progesterone, but progesterone was going to take over. You'll have more progesterone over estrogen. If pregnancy does not occur, then the corpus luteum degenerates, turns into the corpus albicans, and that causes the hormone levels that it was producing of estrogen and progesterone to just drop. And then that drop of these hormones will make the uterine lining disintegrate and shed, and that will be your period. What's left of the corpus luteum is the corpus albicans. During the cycle, estrogen and progesterone will inhibit the increased release of LH and FSH, but then when they drop, that secretion of LH and FSH increases again and restarts the whole process. So this is what it looks like as a diagram now. So day one is always the first day of your period, and so you're bleeding on day one. Bleed usually 4 or 5 days is pretty average, okay? And so while you're bleeding here, your LH and FSH are rising, especially FSH, and they're maturing, continue maturing these follicles, okay? Your ovaries will start producing, so these are at the lowest point, but the ovaries are going to start producing more estrogen. As it produces more estrogen, the uterine lining builds up. Your progesterones are going to be kind of low at the beginning here, and then they're going to start going up. The estrogens kind of peak right before ovulation, and at day 14 is when you would ovulate, and you have that peak in LH and FSH, especially LH, but that big peak in LH causes that release of the egg, and you have ovulation. So really, if you think about it, it's only about a week after you've done bleeding, you're ovulating. Okay, and so that's the release of the egg. So this is a prime time around this time right here to get pregnant, if you're trying to get pregnant, to have sex and, bring the sperm in here. So then these two are going to drop down, and what's left of the follicle turns into the corpus luteum, and the corpus luteum is going to make the progesterone. So progesterone is going to climb here above the estrogen, but the estrogen is still quite pretty high. And so that helps really to finish building up that lining and to maintain pregnancy. Now, if pregnancy doesn't happen within a few days, then it's just going to get a signal, okay, there's no egg that's been implanted, and so this is going to quit producing the progesterone and estrogen, and this is going to drop. This gives you a lot of your PMS symptoms and headaches and stuff. When these guys drop, then you start bleeding, shedding the lining, and it starts over again. Okay, so in which window of time is a female of reproductive age most likely to get pregnant? So pick the one you think here. And if you are a female, do you use an app to track your period? So this is something that I haven't really done until the last few years, and I find it really, really helpful because I don't have to write it in my calendar or anything like that, or my planner, and it prompts me, it reminds me a few days before and all that. And there's so many apps out there. So if you're not cycling, if you're cycling and you're not tracking it with an app, you probably should. It really can also give you some good data to see what's your cycle length. Is it 28 days? Is it 30 days? Is it regular? Is it irregular? Like, what's going on? There are so many where you can also track symptoms and stuff. It's really cool. Okay, so then menopause is when all of this stops. So the menstrual cycles will continue throughout middle age until menopause, when the cycle will cease. The cause of menopause is the aging of the ovaries, when the follicles no longer mature and estrogen levels decline. The mammary glands, so they are your breasts, and so they are an accessory organ of the female reproductive system because they're specialized to produce and secrete milk after pregnancy to maintain a baby, to feed the baby. And the mammary glands are located within the breast on the anterior thorax, and they overlie the pectoralis major muscles. A nipple is located at the tip of each breast. It's surrounded by an area of pigmented skin called the areola, and that's what the baby latches on when the baby nurses. Also gives a target to the baby to latch on. A mammary gland is composed of irregularly shaped lobes that contain glands and a lactiferous duct that leads to the nipple. These glands are actually like modified sweat glands. They don't produce sweat, they produce milk, but they kind of have the same kind of structure. So, and then you have dense connective tissue and fat that separates these lobes. So these are what you go, your glands here, and mammary glands, and your lactiferous ducts, and with fat in, but there's also fat in between and stuff like that. And just talk a little bit about birth control. So birth control refers to the voluntary regulation of the number of offsprings produced, requiring the use of contraception to either avoid fertilization or prevent implantation. So avoid fertilization, you're trying to keep the egg and sperm from meeting. A lot of your barrier methods will do that. So if sperm and egg don't meet, you don't have fertilization. Prevent implantation means that fertilization has happened. The fertilized egg is kind of tumbling down the uterine tube, and we're just going to block its implantation into the uterine lining. And so your barrier methods tend to avoid fertilization. Some of the hormonal they can kind of avoid fertilization. They're more on the prevent implantation, trying to prevent release of eggs and stuff like that. And then you have implantable devices and stuff. We're going to look at the whole list here. So all the methods. So we have coitus interruptus is probably the least effective, which is basically try to pull out method. Not very good and reliable. The rhythm method has to do with you tracking your periods and knowing when you ovulate. And then obviously we're talking about birth control, so about you not wanting to get pregnant. So that would mean that there's a window of time around ovulation where you just would not engage in sex, but you could engage in sex in other times and it would be fine. Mechanical barriers, so your male or female condoms, diaphragm, and cervical cap. Of course, the advantage of the male and female condoms is that they are a barrier that also prevent sexually transmitted diseases and stuff. Diaphragm and cervical cap just go over, they block the entry into the, up the cervix and into the uterus and stuff. Then you have chemical barriers, so creams, foams, and jellies that are spermicidal. Then you have some combined hormone contraceptives. So we have chemical ring, patch, oral contraceptives, where you get a steady dose, basically, of estrogen and progesterone. Usually a low amount of estrogen, higher amount of progesterone. But what it does is it mimics that back half of your cycle where the progesterone is higher than the estrogen, and it's looking to see if you're pregnant. So it thinks you might be pregnant, and it just does that all month long. So that's kind of the idea behind the hormonal contraceptives. Some of them are injectable, so like the depot shot, and then they're supposed to last a longer period of time. There are some that are implants with like a release. So injectable and implants, and even some of the intrauterine devices are also they're hormonal, so they do mess with your hormones. And some of the intrauterine devices don't, but there are some that do, and they are installed to block the fallopian tubes and stuff. So they go in, they stay in for quite a few years. Some of the risk of those is they can like embed into your uterine wall, they can shift around and cause problems and stuff. And then surgical methods is sterilization, is vasectomy and tubal ligation, where you have your tubes tied, and that means really normal babies. But usually you have to be a certain age, and or at least have had so many kids where, you know, they're pretty sure that you know you don't want any more, and you've had your chance, or you're too old to have some, or whatever. So yeah, so rank these or match them to the type of method they are. And then sexually transmitted infections. There are 20 recognized sexually transmitted infections, which are often silent, go unnoticed, especially in females. And one possible complication of sexually transmitted infections, gonorrhea and chlamydia, is pelvic inflammatory disease, which could lead to infection and sterility in females. So some of the STIs are, you know, HIV and even hepatitis, but HPV is another one, so that's human papillomavirus. And then, of course, you know, you get gonorrhea, chlamydia, trichomonas and stuff. Those are all quite common. But yeah, they can cause problems with fertility and stuff. So, so this was a little bit faster than my first one. If you have any questions, let me know. I do want to say also on the birth control, there's a book that I've linked that's really cool, that who you are on birth control is not the same as who you are off of birth control, and it affects a lot of aspects of your life, and you really should know how much it impacts your life. And so you really should do your research if you're going to be on any kind of hormonal birth control. Anyway, so that is your lesson on a female reproductive system.